Shmuel Aron, Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Netanya, Eretz Yisrael, in honor and memory of their dear friend and mentor, Moshe Chaim ben Tzvi Hirsch, and our week of learning sponsors, Dr. Shmuel Robyn Korobkin, in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Shmuel's father, Lipa, ben Yechezkel HaKohen, Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, all of the nishamas will have an aliyah, and the family a neshama. And Abosi, with that, let us begin. We have a really fascinating daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Ayin 70. We will, in Meretz Hashem, begin the new parak today as well, B'Sha'at Tova U'Mitzlachos. And we are picking up on the bottom of Samech Tes Amud Beis, the bottom of 69b. We left off with Itmar. So Abosi, it is the last line, on line 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. So says the Gemara, Itmar, Haba'a Arusasa Bebeis Chamav. An interesting case. So we'll see the following situation. You have Reuven and Rachel, and they're married, but they've only had Eris. So remember again, we all know the halacha here, that a man gives a woman an item of value for the purpose of effecting kiddushin, and now there is a state of Eris and kiddushin, same thing. At this point in time, husband and wife are not living together. So she's living in her father's home. So the case over here is where they had relations. Haba arusasa beis chamav, which literally means he had relations with her in her father's home. That's not literal. In other words, the location of the relations is irrelevant. The idea is that he had relations with her during Erisin. What's the halacha? Now, I will say, she becomes pregnant. She has a child. What's the status of the child? Rav Amar Havlad Mamzer. Wow. So Rav says, ultimately again, the offspring is a mamzer, child is a mamzer. Shmuel said Havlad Shtuki. The child is a Shtuki. Now, boss, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's in Rashi, about 7 lines up from the bottom. Havlad Mamzer, Rashi says, Afal Pisha Shnei Modim Sheba Aleha. And I will say, here's what's interesting. What's fascinating about this concept is as follows. So according to Rav, so the child's a mamzer. Now the novelty here is both Reuven and Rachel are admitting they had relations. In other words, it's not like one person is denying and one person is claiming. They're both agreeing they had relations. Rashi says, nevertheless, Hoil Prutzehi Acharnami Bala ve Abramine. According to Rav, the concern over here is as follows. According to Rav, since this woman has already demonstrated a certain level of pritzus, a certain level of immoral conduct, therefore we have to be concerned that the same way that she acted immorally with her husband, she may have acted immorally with others as well. And I will say, it's a pretty dramatic jump, right? Because Lamaisa, remember, they are married. Now again, to be clear, they have not affected the level of marriage that would allow them to live together. But again, Rav says, once you demonstrate a breach in morality, we have to assume that you are an immoral person, and therefore concerned that she may have had relations with other men. So as much as they're both agreeing that they had relations, Lemaisa, we have to be concerned that perhaps this is someone else's baby other than her Aros. Now I will say, remember, even though she cannot go ahead and have relations with her husband just yet during Erisin, they are married, and if she has relations with another man, that's called adultery. And therefore, again, the offspring would be a mamzer. Okay, Shmuel says shtuki. And I must remember again, we've had this word shtuki. What does shtuki mean? Shtuki comes from the expression that when the child goes ahead and asks his mother, who's my father, right? She says to him, shh. Right? Be quiet. We don't talk about such things in the house. Right? So the idea over here is Vilke Rashi, Shtuki. Rashi says, Sofik Mamzer, Dahamasap Kolon, Ime Arosu, Vikasher, Ime Ineshachrinahu, Hilchach Mamzer Sofeku. So it's interesting. Rashi defines Shtuki as a Sofik Mamzer. Sofik Mamzer. In other words, now both say, now what the ramifications of being a Sofik Mamzer is, but here what I want to point out, both say there's a fundamental point of contention over here. You see, okay, well let's develop this. So fundamental machlokes is Rav and Shmuel. So again, Rav will say the child is a mamzer. Shmuel says the kid is a shtuki. So let's analyze the machlokes. Amar Rava, mistabra milsei de Rav de daime me almo. So they both say, so comes along Rava, And Rava says, I think that Rav's position, remember, Rav holds the kid as a mamzer. So Rava says, I think Rav's position makes sense when it's rumored that this woman is immoral in general. Look at Rashi. The Daime Me'alma, Rashi says, Shechashuda me'achirim. So Rava says, I think Rav's position that the child is a mamzer makes sense when this woman, unfortunately, is known to be of general moral laxity. The lekalach shure kishar b'nei duma shem ksherim the hasam kevan the nesuahi rov be'ilos halach achar habal. Rabbi said, this is a fascinating thing in general. Let's say also we saw this. We actually had this not so long ago. A woman is married. She has an affair with someone, and she becomes pregnant. In a halachic sense, how do we look at the pregnancy? We assume that it is the husband's child, because we assume rov bi'ilos achar habal. The majority of her acts of relations that she has are with her husband, right? And therefore we assume that the child belongs to the husband. In this case over here, Rava says like this: if you have a situation of a woman who's known to be an immoral individual, the problem is you can't say rov bi'ilos achar habal in this case. Why can't you say rov bi'ilos achar habal? Why? Because technically speaking, they're only an eris and they're not living together, right? They're married, but they're not living together. So because halacha l'maaseh they're not living together, you can't say rov bi'ilos achar habal, and that's why Rav would say, so therefore Rav would say, so Rav is coming along and saying like this: when does Rav say that the kid is a mamzer, even though again she has eris and she is technically married? When is that? When she's rumored to be very immoral. Because when she's rumored to be very immoral, we have to assume that the majority of her relations are actually not with the man with whom she had erisin, since they are not living together. Rather, rov bi'ilos have to go after what we call the world of Welt, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, the kid is a mamzer. However, says the Gemara, avalo daima me'alma, basra didei shadin alei. But halacha l'maisa, if it's not rumored that she's very immoral, in other words, that as far as we know, she's a moral woman, the only thing we know about is that she is having relations with her arus, with her husband in erisin, then we assume that the baby is his. So a very important qualifier in Shitas Rav. Amar Rava says, Minamina, how do I know this? Diktani Yolda Tochal. Now, Rabbi say, remember again, Rava says, I'm going to support this assertion. From where? From our Mishnah. Right? Rabbi say, look at Rashi again, 4 lines from the bottom. Diktani Masnesin Yalda Anusa Mafuta Bas Yisrael Mikohen Tochal B'Truma Mishum B'Nad B'Chasken L'Kohen. But remember again, we have this case of what happens. A Kohen has relations with a Bas Yisrael, not married, right? So the act of relations doesn't entitle her to go and eat truma. Even a baby, a pregnancy doesn't entitle her to eat truma. What entitles her to eat truma? Birth, right? She has the baby, she's entitled to eat truma. Now watch this, Rabbi said. So says the Gemara, hey chidami, what's the case? If the woman in question was rumored to be an immoral individual, so at the end of the day, how do you know the baby belongs to the Kohen? Right? Rather, you have to say that, what is that referring to? It's referring to a case where the only person with whom she's rumored to be immoral with was who? Was this Kohen. So when the only person who we know that she's immoral with is with this Kohen, we assume the pregnancy is his. Uma hasam delahai isura ulahai isura. In the case of the Mishnah, this is a single woman. She is prohibited to everyone. Basra dida shadinale. Yet when we know that she's rumored to have relations, not rumored, when we know that the only man with whom she's had relations is the Kohen, we go ahead and we say that it's his kid. Hacha delahai isura ulahai hetera lakol shekain. In this case over here of our Brisa, where she is married to someone, she has kiddushin with someone, and she's not rumored to be a generally immoral woman, we go ahead and we assume that the baby is from her aros. So I will say, just to clarify what we have until this point in time. Here's the machlokes. Reuven and Rachel had erisin. Rachel becomes pregnant. They're both admitting to the fact that they had relations. What's the status of the kid? Rav says mamzer. Shmuel says shtuki. Comes along Rava, and Rava says, when does Rav say mamzer? when she's known to, unfortunately, be an immoral individual. Because halacha lemaisa, and under those circumstances, we can't assume that the baby belongs to Ruvain. But lemaisa, if we don't have any rumors of immorality, the only person with whom she had relations with, to our knowledge, is her husband, is her arus, then we assume that the baby is his. Beautiful. And Rava's proof from our Mishnah. Beautiful. Amle Abaye. Abaye says, the olam eimalacha kol hecha dedamya minay afagav dolo daimi me alma. Amarav havlad mamzer. So we'll say Abaye argues. Abaye argues on Rava's interpretation. And Abaye says, not true. According to Rav, Rav holds the kid as a mamzer in all circumstances. Even when we have no rumors of widespread immorality, right? We have no rumors that she's immoral with a lot of people. Even if all we know is that she had relations with her arus, at the end of the day, the kid is still going to be a mamzer. Why is that? Rabbi says, this is incredible. My taimo, darmina me da afkara nafsha lagabe arus, afkara nafsha li alma. Wow. Rabbi said, listen to this. Listen to this. Abaye says, Rava's position is the following. Halacha l'maisa, once you've demonstrated that you're willing to be immoral, immorality knows no bounds. So at the end of the day, once she has done something illicit with Ruvain, with her arus, once she's allowed herself to be immoral with her arus, then ultimately, again, we assume that she is immoral with other people as well. Which Rabbi say, if you think about it, is such a dramatic jump. Is really such a dramatic jump, because one can make so many distinctions between relations during Erusin versus relations with other people. But Lamaisa will say, Abaye's svara is, and it's an interesting like psychology of sin svara, which is that once you break down barriers, these barriers you do break down, these barriers I don't break down. We know it from ourselves. Then I will say, if I keep the walls high and I keep the gidarim intact, I'm solid. Once I begin to bring down the gidarim, once I begin to bring down those protective walls, by definition, so many things become permissible in my eyes that I never thought would be permissible to myself. So I will say, therefore, again, Abai comes along and says, Rava, I reject your notion. Rav holds the kid is a mamzer, even if we only know that she had relations with her arus. Because once she has acted immorally, we have to assume that immorality is not just with her arus, but with other people as well. Says Abaye, Umasnisin, what do you do with the Mishnah? We both say our Mishnah. Remember again, our Mishnah, where the Kohen had relations with the Bas Yisrael, and we said that if she goes in and gives birth to a baby, that halacha l'maisa, she could eat truma. But I don't understand why. How do you know it's the Kohen's baby? This is interesting. The Gemara says, "Masnisin sheyushteim chavush beis asurin." Right? What's the case? Right? What's the case? They're both incarcerated together. So I will say, in other words, the idea in the Mishnah must be a case where they were alone and incarcerated together. There was no access to anyone else, and therefore halacha l'maisa, we know that the baby is the Kohen's baby. Okay? Se'ikid da'amri. Others say, alternate version of this discussion. So I will say another version. So far we have the machlokes Rav and Shmuel. We have Rava's interpretation of the machlokes, Abaye's interpretation of the machlokes. Now a third version of the machlokes. Ikid da'amri. Others say, so the Gemara says, everyone agrees, now what does this mean? Halacha l'maisa, in a case where both Reuven and Rachel admit that they had relations, right? Where everyone's, there's no machlokus about the facts. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, they had relations with each other. Then under those circumstances, everyone agrees that the baby is Reuven's. V'hachi itmar, arusa she'ibra. I will say, where does the machlokes come up? The machlokes comes up where we don't have clarity about whose baby it is. Right? We don't have clarity, either because maybe Ruvain is not admitting to the act of relations, Ruvain's not around, right? Perhaps, again, Rachel did have relations with other people. So in that case where there's ambiguity, so Rav Amar Havlad Mamzer, Shmuel Amar Havlad Shtuki. In that case, Rav says that the baby is a mamzer. Shmuel says the baby is a shtuki, suffix mamzer. So the Gemara, so Amar Rava says, Mistabra mil say Rav, delo daime mine v'daime me almo. So Rava says, I think that Rav's position that the baby is a mamzer makes sense in a situation where she is rumored to have been generally immoral. Generally immoral, right? This is the reputation she has. We'll say ultimately again, and therefore Allah Chalamais, that's why we have to assume that the baby is a mamzer. Top of ayin, aval daima mine, afal gav v'daima me alma, basre dide shadinale. But again, comes along. This is Rava. We'll say, remember again, this Ikeda Amri is just a little bit of a different version of the previous discussion. So here you're coming along, Rava saying, when does Rav say that the baby is a mamzer? That's in a case where she's rumored to be a generally immoral person. But if halacha l'maisa, there's no general call of immorality. And we just happen to know that she had relations with her chasan, then basre didei shadinale. Then even Rav would agree that we do not declare the baby to be a mamzer based on this, and we will say that the baby is Ruvain's son. Amar Rava, and Rava will say, Mina aminallah. How do I know that this is the case? Diktani yolda tochal. Because the Mishnah says, in the case of the Kohen, who has relations with the Bas Yisrael, that Allah Chalamais, if she becomes pregnant and then has a baby, that she's permitted to eat truma. So what's the case? Hechidami. Ilema de daimi mine, velo daimi me alma, sricha lememar de techal. If it's a case where all we know is that she had relations with the Kohen, and there's no other rumor, she's not even rumors wrong. There's no knowledge that she's ever had relations with anyone else. Do you have to say that she could eat truma? Obviously, she could eat truma. She's a woman who has a baby with a Kohen. Elalav de daime name mi alma. Rather, it must be a case where what? She's also rumored to have been immoral in general. Umma hasam delahai isura ulahai isura, and nevertheless, in that case, where ultimately again she's usher to most people, right? In the case of the Mishnah, she's usher to everyone. As a single woman, in other words, we'll say she could technically marry anyone, but halacha l'maisa in her single state, she's not permitted to have relations. Yet basre didei shadinale, we go ahead and we assume that it is the Kohen's baby. Haha de lahai isura ulahai hetera lakol shekain. Therefore, we'll say in this case over here, where she's married to Reuven, not married to anyone else, then Allah Chalamais, of course it makes sense to go ahead and attribute the baby to Reuven. Amar le Abayi will say the olam emelacha. So we'll say again in this Ikeda Amri, it's the same machlokis in the interpretation of Abayi and Rava. Amar le Abayi the olam emelacha kol heicha de daime me alma. Afagav didaime mine amarav havlad mamzer. Abai will say, I'll say a little bit different. In reality, any time that she is rumored to be, or any time that we know that she is generally immoral, halacha lamaisa, in that case, kol eicha didaime mi alma, afagav didaime mine amarav havlad mamzer. Rav holds the kid as a mamzer any time that we know that she is generally immoral. So what's the case of the Mishnah? What's the case in the Mishnah? That we automatically attribute the pregnancy to the Kohen. Umas nisin bidelo daimeklal. The Mishnah is talking about a case where she is not known to us to be a generally immoral individual. Okay, so we'll say it's a very, very interesting case. How do we pass halacha l'maisa? So I'll share with you something very interesting here. So the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, this is in Even HaEzer, Simin Dalid, Sif Chav Zayin. Listen to this. Shulchan Aruch says, Arusa shenis abra b'beis aviha. So again, about say same case we were dealing with up until now. Halacha l'maisa. So Reuven and Rachel have done Erusin, Kiddushin. She's living in her father's home. They're not living together. She becomes pregnant. So what's the halacha? Im hi omeres shemea aros nis abra. If she says the baby belongs to Ruvain, the baby belongs to Ruvain, Havlad kosher. So I will say, here's what's interesting. The halacha says, if he admits it, right? If he admits it, or he's not in our presence to deny it. He's not in our presence to deny it. We assume that the child is his. So I will say, it's actually really quite fascinating. So let's listen to this. Even if the Ara says, he doesn't deny it, he just says, I don't remember. Sometimes you just forget stuff, right? It happens, right? So we'll say he doesn't deny it, but he just doesn't remember. Again, unless he explicitly denies it, the baby is his. The baby is his. Listen to this. What happens? Ultimately, interestingly enough, if he denies it, then ultimately, again, we treat the child as a mamzer. So we'll say, I just want to point out that according to the Shulchan Aruch, Shulchan Aruch then goes on in Chavchas and talks about So we'll say, so interestingly enough, in a vacuum, where everyone is agreeing that they had relations, the baby belongs to the aros, right? Yeah, and even if the aros is not there to deny it, the baby belongs to the aros. In situations where there's a general knowledge that this woman is immoral, so halacha l'maisa, that changes things, and that could create a situation of safek mamzerus. Okay, it's an interesting halacha. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, mamzer posel umachil. So let's remember again, in yesterday's Mishnah, we had these fascinating cases of the grandson, right? The grandson mamzer, the grandson eved, who the grandson mamzer, right, goes ahead and has an impact on the grandmother and her ability to consume truma. So the Gemara says, mamzer posel umachil, tan rabbanan v'zera in law, in the Ezra. So remember again, this was the case where halacha l'maisa, a Yisraelis, right, Bas Yisrael, marries a Kohen. What happens when she marries a Kohen? What does she get to do? Truma, right? They then have what was the case in the Mishnah? They then had a daughter, right? Daughter married a guy. They had a child, according to the Mishnah. The offspring of a Jewish woman and a guy is a mamzer. Then let's say daughter dies, husband dies. If you remember again, what's the halacha? Right? Grandma Bas Yisrael can still continue to eat truma. Why? Because she has offspring from the Kohen, albeit mamzer offspring, but nevertheless offspring. So says the Gemara, mamzer posel machal tan rabbanon v'zera ein la. So the Gemara says v'zera ein la, ein li ela zar'a. I only know her offspring. Zera zar'a minayin. How do you know that even halacha l'maisa grandchildren? Talmud lomar v'zera ein la mikol makom. Because we'll say, remember again, the halacha. All the Gemara is trying to point out over here is that halacha l'maisa grandchildren work the same thing as children to enable the consumption of truma. So says the Gemara, ein li ela zera kasher zera pasal minayin. I only know that this applies to kosher. I'm sorry. Did I skip? Oh, I'm sorry. All right, let me just finish up this. Fine, I'll go back. Okay, thank you. Ha'eved posel, sorry. Ha'eved posel mishum biyah, my apologies. So we'll say, remember again, eved posel mishum biyah. So remember again, this was the other case where halacha l'maisa. So woman marries, let's just go with Bas Yisrael, Bas Kohen. Bas Kohen marries Yisrael. This is the better case here. Bas Kohen marries Yisrael. They have a son. They have a son. Son marries a shifcha, right? Son marries a shifcha. They have a child. The child is an eved. So we'll say, so now let's go back. Son dies. Husband dies. What's her status? Bas Kohen grandma, what's her status? So she can now eat truma. She can eat truma. Why? Because she has no descendants. What about her eved grandson? Her eved grandson is not misyaches ter. Thank you. Says the Gemara, my taima, amrakra isha v'yiladet yiladena. Because it was like, by avodim, who does the offspring of an eved belong to? Who does it belong to? The master. Good. So let's go back to mamzer posel l'machil. Back to the mamzer case. So remember again what happened over here. In the case of mamzer, this was the situation where, again, Bas Yisrael marries a Kohen, right, entitled to Truma. They have a daughter, Mazel Tov. Daughter marries a guy. Unfortunately, offspring, according to the Mishnah, of a guy and a Jewish woman is mamzer. Now what happens? Daughter dies, husband dies. One would have thought that so again, halacha l'maisa, the presence of mamzer offspring still allows the Bas Yisrael to continue to eat truma. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan v'zera ein la. She has no offspring. Ella einli ella zar'a. I only know direct offspring. Zera zar'a minayin. I know that even grandchildren will allow her to continue to eat truma. Talmud lomar v'zera ein la mikol makom. We look at lashon of zera ein la. She doesn't have offspring as an expansive lashon. Any type of offspring, even not direct children but grandchildren. Se'einli ella zera kasher. I only know about offspring that's genealogically fit. Zera pasal minayin. What about genealogically unfit offspring? Talmud lomar v'zera ein la ayin la. So we'll say, so it's interesting play on words. The zera, she doesn't have offspring. So ein, vocalize it as ayin, but with an ayin. Ayin. Investigate her family. And as long as there is some level of offspring, that's fine, even if they're genealogically unfit. Vaha fixe l'zera zara. But already use that to teach us the drasha of that grandchildren count as children. Zera zaralo itztirich kra b'nei banim harehein kibanim. We'll say everyone knows you don't need that drasha because grandchildren are treated like children. Ki itztirich kra. Where is the pasuk needed? L'zera pasal to teach us. I will say that if a person has grandchildren, even if they're genealogically unfit, that still allows her to go ahead and eat truma. So Rabbi said this is very important. So even though in this case over here, the Bas Yisrael, who's married to the Kohen, her husband passed away, her daughter passed away, the only offspring she has still living is who? Her mamzer grandson, even though her grandson is genealogically unfit, that is still called offspring from the Kohen, and enables her to continue to eat truma. So it says the Gemara, Amrle Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan Kiman, whose opinion is reflected here in the Mishnah? Rabbi Akiva de Amar Yesh Mamzer Mechayve Lavin. I will say, by the way, the notion that marrying a guy produces a mamzer, right, is the sheet of Rabbi Akiva, right? Because Rabbi Akiva holds that mamzerus comes from any situation of even Chayve Lavin. To which the Gemara says not necessarily Afilu Tima Rabbanon, but Ovid Kochavim ve'Eved Modu. I will say it might not be so because it could be that even the Rabbanon who hold that in general mamzer only comes from, let's say, Chayve Misa or Chayve Krisos, would agree in the case of a guy, that marrying a guy creates mamzerus. Why? Dichi Asar Avdimi Am Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdim Mishum Rabbeinu Oved Kochavim ve'Eved Abba Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. So I will say it's very interesting that apparently Rav Dimi and Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, when they came, they said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that Ovid Kochavim and Eved, who have relations with a Jewish woman, the offspring is a mamzer. So if you look at Rashi, Mishum Rabbeinu Rabbi Va'ata Gav Lashmuin and the Palagad Rabbi Akiva Beperk Rabbi Gamliel Tamar Dvar Halal Amurim El Div Rabbi Akiva V'Leilo Sir LeAfilochi BaOvid Kochavim VeEved Moda Ki the Amar BaCholitz Eved Ukamlot Tischad. So I'll just say something very interesting. It seems to be that in general we have this fundamental machlokes, right? What type of relationships create mamzerus? So on one hand you have everyone, right? And everyone holds what types of relationships? Chayve misa, chayve kares, right? Those type of relationships. Rabbi Akiva is the opinion who holds no, even relationships punishable by a lav create mamzerus. It could be also that what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that halacha l'maisa, there is another school of thought that disagrees with Rabbi Akiva in all cases except for when a woman has a child with an eved or a guy or an akum. Then in that case they will agree that the offspring becomes a mamzer, which I will say would be very interesting because halacha l'maisa, it could be that they would agree with that in that situation in order to bolster our stance against intermarriage, right? That could be, in other words, that halacha l'maisa, if as a result of intermarriage, if child is genealogically fine, that's one thing. But saying the kid is a mamzer, that could be a very strong stand against intermarriage as well. Okay, something interesting. In any event, I will say again, we don't paskin that way. We paskin that halacha l'maisa, if a Jewish woman has a child with a non-Jewish man, the child is 100% Jewish. Again, the only thing that sometimes comes up, we saw this, is if it's a girl marrying a Kohen, right? There are opinions that hold that a girl with a non-Jewish father should not marry a Kohen. But even that is subject to machlokes. So we paskin against Rabbi Akiva in all of these cases. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara, says end off. So Kohen Gadol Pam Shapol. So remember again, last case in the Mishnah was an interesting case. This was the case of where halacha l'maisa, if you remember, a Bas Kohen. Remember this was the case. A Bas Kohen married a Yisrael. So remember again, once she marries a Yisrael, what happens? No more truma. She then has a daughter. Mazel tov. Daughter marries a Kohen. Fantastic, right? Fantastic. They have a kid, right? They have a kid, and mamish, their kid becomes Kohen Gadol. Then what happens? Daughter dies, husband dies. Who do you have left? Grandma Bas Kohen and grandson Kohen Gadol. As a result of grandson Kohen Gadol, what can't Grandma Bas Kohen do? Eat truma, right? Why? Because that grandson Kohen Gadol is the offspring from her Yisrael husband. And as long as there is offspring from her Yisrael husband, she can't eat truma. So this is an incredible thing. So remember, and yet the grandson from her Yisrael husband himself is the Kohen Gadol. So sometimes you could have a grandson Kohen Gadol who prevents you from going ahead and eating truma. Says the Rabbanon, Harini kaparas ben biti kuza shema achileni b'truma. So I'll say, so sometimes a person has to say, I am the atonement, ultimately again, for ben biti kuza, for literally again, the son of my daughter. Rabbi say, kuza, Rashi says, is kli katan, kilomar mamzer shehu garua. I am the atonement for my daughter who did not act appropriately and had a mamzer. Shema achileni b'truma. But sometimes, again, that mamzer enables me to eat truma. Right, Rabbi? I remember again, that's the case of a Bas Yisrael who marries a Kohen. They have a daughter. She marries a guy. They have a kid. That's the mamzer. But that mamzer is considered to be the offspring of the Kohen, which allows her to continue to eat truma. So sometimes a woman says, I am the kapara, I am the atonement for my daughter who acted inappropriately, had a mamzer, but it's this inappropriate act that allows me to eat truma. Ve'eni kaparas ben biti kada sheposlani minat truma. But I won't be a kapara, ultimately, again, for my grandson, who's a great vessel, the Kohen Gadol case, who prevents me from eating truma. Okay, fine. It's just interesting that sometimes it's your grandson mamzer who allows you to eat truma, and your grandson Kohen Gadol who precludes you from eating truma. Which also is another incredible mussar, which is sometimes in life you never know where your nachas is going to come from, right? Sometimes the nachas comes from the grandson Kohen Gadol, sometimes the nachas comes from the grandson mamzer. Could hadrin alach amon. I will say mazel tov. New parak. Ha'arel. So we'll say still with truma. Ha'arel v'chalatmeim lo yochlu b'truma. So we'll say a Kohen. This is what the Kohen himself. That if the Kohen is an arel or the Kohen is tamei, can't eat truma. The sheyem va'avdeim yochlu b'truma. But we'll say, but interestingly enough, as much as the Kohen who is an arel or the Kohen who is tamei can't eat truma, their wives can eat truma. Right? So they themselves can't. But being married to them ultimately allows a person to eat truma. P'tzua daka, krus shavcha. So we'll say p'tzua daka is a Kohen with crushed testicles. Krus shavcha, we'll say, is a Kohen with an injury that prevents the zera, the semen, from coming out with force, but rather trickles out. Sehein v'avdein yochlu. So we'll say these Kohanim themselves and their servants have the ability to go ahead and eat truma. But I will say, but their wives, remember again, these men are not really allowed to marry. Right? Can't marry into the general pool. If they do marry, their wives are disqualified and cannot eat truma. This is actually very interesting. What happens if a Kohen was married? He was married, totally fine. And then he becomes a p'tzua daka during marriage. right? An accident occurs, he becomes a psuadaka during marriage. So we'll say, in that case, interestingly enough, his wife is allowed to continue to eat truma as long as they don't have relations. Once they have relations, she becomes a halala and can't eat truma. But until the act of relations, she's allowed to eat truma. There's a psuadaka. Now we'll say, what's a psuadaka? Kol sheniftu habeitzim shalo v'afilu achas mehen. Any Kohen whose testicles were crushed, even one of them. Ukrushavcha, what's the krushavcha? We'll see, this is actually very interesting. Kol shenikeres hagid. Kol shenichras hagid. Now we'll say, this is actually very interesting. Krushavcha means literally, he's missing part of his anatomy, right? He's missing part of the aver, of the male member. So the Gemara says, V'im nishtayer me'atara afilu kichot hasara kasher. Now we'll say, we're going to discuss this if there is part of the atara. And I will say, we'll get into this sugya. So if part of the atara, which I will say we call the corona, right? If some part of the tip is still there, then ultimately, again, he's kosher. And I will say, we'll discuss which part we're exactly discussing and how much of it has to be intact. But I will say, very important halachas, because again, remember, this really has to do with the eligibility of a Kohen. Ultimately, not to eat truma. Interestingly enough, you can eat truma no matter what, but it affects his ability to marry. We'll discuss. Says the Gemara, Tanya, Amar Belazar, Minay la'aroshen alcha b'truma. How do you know that an uncircumcised Kohen can't eat truma? Well, so this is the case we're going to focus on initially. So how do I know that halacha l'maisa, an arel, an uncircumcised Kohen, can't eat truma? So the Gemara says, Ne'amar toshav v'sacher b'Pesach. So what's actually very interesting. The Torah says, by Karban Pesach, toshav v'sachir lo yochal bo. The toshav and the sachir of a person cannot eat at the Karban Pesach. Now we'll say, we're going to define these terms in just a moment. Toshav v'sachir b'Pesach, v'ne'amar toshav v'sachir b'truma. And it says toshav and sachir by truma. Now we'll say, truma says, v'chol zar lo yochal kodesh, toshav v'sachir lo yochal kodesh. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So it says by Karban Pesach that toshav and sachir can't eat, and it says by truma, toshav and sachir can't eat. So what's going on over here? Says the Gemara, ma toshav v'sachir by Pesach aril aserbo. Just like by toshav and sachir by Pesach, someone who's uncircumcised also can't eat Pesach. So av toshav v'sachir by truma aril aserbo. So too toshav and sachir by truma, ultimately an arel can't eat as well. Okay, now we still haven't defined what toshav and sachir refers to, right? I know what the words mean. Toshav means someone who lives with you. Sachir means someone who's hired or rented by you. So the Gemara Rabbi Akiva says, "Inut tzarach." You don't need to get into all this. Hareyu omer ish lerabos ha'arel. Rabbi say the pasuk says ish mizera Aaron. Ultimately, ish tells me that halacha l'maisa, an orel is not permitted to go ahead and eat truma. Omer Rebbe Lazar Omer Ne'emar. Let's analyze this. Ne'emar toshav asar Pesach. Ne'emar toshav asar truma. It says toshav and sachir by Karban Pesach, and it says toshav and sachir by truma. Ma toshav v'sachir amar by Pesach arel aser bo. Just like toshav and sachir by Pesach, I also know that an orel, someone who's uncircumcised, can't eat Karban Pesach. Ach af toshav v'sachir ha'amar b'truma arel aser bo. So too again, toshav and sachir teaches me about truma that an arel is also not permitted to eat truma. So Rabbi say, let's analyze this for just a moment. Mufna. Now it must be, actually it's declared to say, Mufna. Rabbi say, remember we've had this, we know this through our journeys through Shas. The Gemara is making a gzera shava. In order to make a gzera shava, what do you need? You need the words to be open. Open means they're not used for any other drasha. If they're used for a different drasha, then halacha l'maisi, you can't use them to make the gzera shava. So Moshe they're mufna, di'i lav mufna, because if the words are, if toshav and sachar are not open, oikala mifrach, you can make a pircha. In other words, I could say, you can't compare Pesach to Truma. Why? Mala Pesach shekin chayav ala mishum pigol, no sar v'tameh. Rabbi say, Karban Pesach has all of its own strictures, right? You're chayiv again, pigol, no sar tameh. Loi, first white line above the bottom. Loi, Afnuye mufna. Ultimately, the drush is open. The word is open. The phrase is open, and halacha l'maaseh can be used for drasha purposes. So the Gemara says, "Hey mufna, se'id truma." So which one is open? If you want to say that it's the toshav and sachar of truma, mitzrach tzrichi. The truth is, I need that phrase. It teaches me something very important. What does it teach me? Tisanya, listen to this. So we'll say we have to define our terms. Who's a toshav? Toshav ze kanoi kinyan olam. Now we'll say, listen to this. Toshav and Sachir, the Gemara explains, refers to two different types of Jewish servants. Jewish servants. A Toshav is what we call an Eved Li'olam. Now, when we say an Eved Li'olam by a Jewish servant, when does he work until? When does he work until? Yovel. So this is the man, a Jewish servant is working with you until Yovel. Sachir, Zeh Kanoi Kinyan Shanim. A Sachir is what type of servant? He's the type of servant that's going to work with you for how long? 6 years. Up until Shemitah, right? 6 years. I say 6 years, yeah. So the Gemara says, so Rabosai, I just want to point out, what does that teach you? By Chum Rabosai, here's what's interesting. Anyone who is owned by the Kohen gets to eat Truma. What type of servants does that include? Non-Jewish servants. Avodim Kinanim. It does not apply to Avodim Ivrim. Suppose it is incredible. Your Jewish servant, right? A Kohen's Jewish servant does not get to eat Truma because they're not owned by the Kohen. So Toshav and Sachir don't get to eat Truma. So the Gemara says, V'yomar Toshav al Yomar Sachir. Just say Toshav and I don't say Sachir. V'ani Omer, and I would say, Kani kinyan olam eno ochel, Kani kinyan shanan l'kol shekain. I will say, it goes without saying, if the Eved who's with you until Yovel doesn't eat, then what? Certainly, the Eved who's only with you for 6 years doesn't eat. And I would have thought then, if it would have just said one of them, I would have thought Toshav means the Eved who's with you until Yovel. But ultimately, the Eved who is with you until Yovel would eat. So therefore, again, Toshav, So we'll say, the Gemara says, 1 second. When you say that the words are open for drasha, for exposition purposes, I don't understand. I need Toshav and Sachir by Truma, because that actually teaches me a very important halacha. Toshav and Sachir refer to two different types of avodim. Toshav means an Eved Ivri who's with me until Yovel. Sachir means an Eved Ivri who's with me for 6 years. And the Torah is teaching me that these avodim can't eat Truma. Ela de Pesach mufni. It must say that Toshav and Sachir by Pesach are open for exposition purposes. Okay, let's analyze this. Hi Toshav and Sachir because of Rechmana b'Pesach. My nihu. But say who are the Toshav and Sachir mentioned by Pesach? Inema Toshav and Sachir mamish mishum dahavile Toshav and Sachir iftulu b'Pesach. So say I don't understand. If Toshav and Sachir by Pesach mean the same thing as Toshav and Sachir by Truma. So we just established who are the Toshav and Sachir by Truma? Who are they? Who are they? Jewish servants. So now the Torah says Toshav and Sachir don't have to eat Karban Pesach. So you're telling me now that Jewish servants don't have to eat Karban Pesach? So because there's someone's servant, ultimately Iftar Lemi Pesach, V'akamelan Gabe Truma, we learn by Truma, Dilo Achil Amad Beis Rabosai, Alma Lo Kani Le Rabbe. Hachenami lo kanile rabbe. The Bible said we just learned before that Toshav and Sachir by Truma refer to Jewish servants, and they don't eat Truma. The Bible said, why don't Jewish servants eat Truma? Why not? Why not? Because they're not owned by their master. Because as much as they're working by the master, they're not owned, they're independent. Well, if that's the case, if they're independent, then Toshav and Sachir by Pesach should what? Be chayiv. Be chayiv. What's the pshat? Ella, says the Gemara, Ella la'afnuye. Stay for you have to say inachinami, right? That halacha l'maisa, Toshav and Sachir by Pesach means something different, and ultimately, again, they're there for exposition purposes. They're open. There's no drasha savakati muf no mitzad echad. So that only tells me the Gzeir Shav is open on one end. So just understand what's happening over here. Right? Making Gzeir Shava between Truma and Pesach, right? And we're saying that Allah says Toshav and Sachir by Pesach. It says Toshav and Sachir by Truma. Just like Toshav and Sachir represent the category of people who are exempt, right, by Pesach and by Truma. So included in that list of people who are exempt is the Orel. is the Arel, is someone who's uncircumcised. Someone who's uncircumcised can't eat Korban Pesach. Someone who's uncircumcised won't eat Truma as well. So Rabbi say, in order to do that, we just have to demonstrate that Toshav and Sachir is not used for anything else. So we've demonstrated Toshav and Sachir is used for something by Truma, but apparently by Pesach, it's open for exposition purposes. Va'akanti, mufna mitzadechotu. The Rabbi say, this is Gzeira Shava, where the expository words are open on one end, not both ends. V'shamini li Rabbi Elazar, the Amar, mufna mitzad echad, the maiden umashivin. So Rabbi say, we learned that halacha l'maisa, when you have a Gzeira Shava where the words are only open on one end but not both ends, in that case you could refute the Gzeira Shava. Kevan de legufei lo tzarich. The Gemara says no, it's really considered to be open on one end. I'll tell you why. Since I don't really need this drasha at all, shadi chad alamad, shadi chad amelamed. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa. Look at Rashi. I will say, kevan. It's a little bit lower down in Rashi, right across all the walls from Tosos Shadi. Kevan de legufei lo tzarich. Lo toshav lo sacher de lo efshar luk minhu kipshatayu klal. How do they trey krayisere? So Rabbi say, since in reality, again, I can't really use toshav and sacher for any kind of drasha, therefore halacha l'maisa, it's really considered to be mufna mishnei tzdadim. Go ahead and use one of them as the source, and one of them ultimately again as the limud, and therefore again v'havile gzeru shava mufna mishnei tzdadim. To which the Gemara says, Ima Pesach. So go say, therefore the Gemara says, Halacha l'maisa. The way the Gemara seems to be learning it out right now is, remember again, we started all this with one simple question. What's my one simple question? The Mishnah told me that an Arel can't go ahead, a Kohen Arel can't eat Truma. All we're trying to figure out is what? How do I know that? How do I know that? And Halacha l'maisa, we're going ahead and establishing that essentially we're learning it out of Gzeira Shava, of Toshav Sachir from Truma or from Pesach to Truma. Just like in Pesach, Toshav and Sachir can't eat. In addition to Toshav and Sachir, who else is included in Arel? So too by Truma, where also Toshav and Sachir can't eat Truma, it must be that included in that list is who else? An Arel. Okay. To which the Gemara says, well, here's the problem. If you're going to do that, Ima Pesach onin aserbo, af Truma onin aserbo. Well, why don't I say the same thing over here? If by Pesach, Rabbi is saying an onin is someone who just lost a relative prior to burial, halacha l'maisa, such a person is not permitted to go ahead and eat Korban Pesach. Maybe by Truma, an onin can't eat Korban Pesach either. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, Amar Kra, v'chol zar. Rabbi say, Zoros amarti l'cha, v'lo aninos. No, Rabbi say, when it comes to Truma, the disqualifier for Truma is what? Being a zar. If you're a non-Kohen, you can't eat the Truma. So I will say, but aninos does not fall under the umbrella of Zoros. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, a Kohen who is an onen is permitted to go ahead and eat Truma. I said the Gemara, Ema v'lo arelos. Well, one second. Why don't I say that therefore it's only Zaros that precludes you from eating Truma, not Arelos, and therefore a Kohen who's an Arel should be permitted to eat. Haksiv Toshav Sachir. Ultimately, then we revert back to the Gzeira Shava of Toshav and Sachir. Uma Rois. So Rabbi says, I don't understand. How do you know what to include and what to exclude? Right? So what we're doing, Rabbi says, here's what's happening. You're building a construct. Rabbi says, what's the construct? Toshav and Sachir. Toshav and Sachir is the linkage between Truma and Korban Pesach. And pretty much what we're going to say is, whoever can't eat by Korban Pesach, can't eat by Truma as well. And we use that to really learn the halacha of an Arel, someone who's uncircumcised. Someone who's an Arel can't eat Korban Pesach, and therefore again the halachic bridge, Toshav Sachir, right? Creates a Gzeira Shava, says an Arel can't eat Korban Pesach, and an Arel can't eat what? Can't eat Truma as well. Okay, so the Gemara says, well, one second, you're going to build the bridge. So therefore, again, so too, just like an onen can't eat Korban Pesach, an onen can't eat Truma. But that's not true. The Gemara says, no. By Truma, the only disqualifier is what? Zoros. And an onen could eat. So the Gemara says, but if it's Zoros, then maybe an Arel should be able to eat as well. To which the Gemara says, Gzeira Shava. So I'll say, now what you're doing is, selective gezerah shava application. And everyone gets annoyed by selective gezerah shava applications. What you're saying is, Toshav and Sacher creates a bridge to teach you Orel, so Orel you'll take from Pesach, but Onen you won't. I don't understand. How do you know what to take and what not to take? Umarois, mistabra arelos, havilei rabuye. So let's listen to this. It makes sense to say that that a Kohen who's an Orel can't eat Truma. Why not? Because we'll say, what's unique about arelos? Mechusar maisa. He's missing an action, right? The action referred to over what is what? Referred to over here is what? Bris milah, right? So he's missing bris milah. Umaisa begufo. And this is something that applies to his body. Va'anush kares, and I will say the punishment for being an oral and eating, right, is kares. V'yesh no lifnei adibor. Furthermore, again, I will say, interesting enough, the mitzvah of bris milah applied even before Matan Torah, right? Avram Avinu, umilas zechara va'avadav ma'akeves, and ultimately, again, having uncircumcised servants also prevents you from eating truma. So I will say, so the Gemara is pointing out over here that there's a compelling reason to include orel in the list of people prohibited to eat truma. Because look at all of the qualities of arelos, right? Adrabah, aninos, I would say, I would include aninos. Why? Havilei l'rabuye, shekain yeshta b'chol shah. I will say, aninos applies all the time. No, hages ba'anoshim va'anoshim. It applies both to men and women. Interesting. Ve'ein biyad l'takines atzmo. And I will say, a person has no way to quote unquote rid themselves of aninos. To which the Gemara says, you're right, b'hanach nefishin. The list by arelos is longer than the list of aninos. So I will say, this is very interesting. So essentially what's happening over here is as follows. We're going ahead and we're creating the Gzerah Shava of Toshav Sachir, right, which links Pesach to Truma. And what that linkage does is it gives us arelos. Just like by Karban Pesach, you can't eat the Karban if you're an Orel, so too by Truma, you can't eat Truma if you're an Orel. But yet we don't allow a full linkage. So even though by Pesach, an Onen can't eat Karban Pesach, we don't say that therefore an Onen can't eat Truma. So the Gemara says, well, why are you including Arelos and not Aninos? To which the Gemara says, essentially, Arelos has more unique characteristics to it. More unique characteristics. Therefore, we'll include that and not Aninos. So the Gemara says, okay, Rava says, below Hanach Nefishin, Nami la Matzes Amris, Shavkinan Arelos. The truth is, Rava says, even if the list by Arelos wasn't longer, you still couldn't not include. You can't not, I know bad English, but you can't not include Arelos. And I'll tell you why. Tichsev begufei de Pesach. So ultimately, it was because, remember, Arelos itself is written explicitly by Karban Pesach. V'alfinon aninos mi Pesach, the Pesach gufei mi meiser gaminon. To which the Gemara says, but I don't understand if that's the case. Why not learn out aninos from Pesach as well? Ultimately, again, it was the Pesach gufei meiser gaminon. Pesach itself was on that from meiser sheni. Ima Pesach milas zechara va'avadav ma'akeves. Af truma mila zechara v'avadav ma'akeves. I will say, because you would say, just like by Karban Pesach, circumcision of one's servants ultimately precludes him from partaking. So too by truma, I would say that the circumcision of his avodim should preclude him. Amakra umalta oso az yochal bo milas zechara v'avadav ma'akeves bo milecha b'Pesach ve'ein milas zechara v'avadav ma'akeves b'truma. Because we'll say, so now we're going a little bit wild, and we're trying to include other things as well. The Gemara says Torah is specific by telling us that it's only the circumcision of your avodim that has a ramification by Karban Pesach, but not by Truma. If that's the case, why don't they say the following? The pasuk says, any aral may not eat it, bo eina ochel, aval ochel hu b'truma, can't eat Pesach, but maybe he can eat Truma, haksiv toshav v'sacher. There you have the Gzerah Shava of Toshav v'sacher. Umara is mistabra arelos to gufei havilei l'rabuye. Say once again, we're back to where we were. How do you know to include arelos and to exclude other things? I'll tell you why. Arelos is unique. Why? Number one, shekin ma'aseh begufo. Number one, it's an action in your body. Va'anush kares Panashalai kares. Adraba milas zechara va'avadav havilei rabuye. Why I would include the case of non-circumcision of his avodim, because ultimately, again, it applies at all times. To which the Gemara says, Hanach nefishin. Ultimately, again, still the halachos concerning his own milah are more voluminous than the halachos concerning milas avodav. Va'ibay sema below hanach nefishin namilo masas amrit. Mi'ika midi de arilos to gufelo ma'akvabe, arilos tachrini ma'akvabe. Rabbi says another reason why it doesn't make sense. It would not make sense to say that you being an arel would not prevent you from doing something, but the arelos of your servants would prevent you from doing something. So Rabbi say, we'll stop over here for today. We're going to continue with this a little bit more, but Rabbi say, but the takeaway for today from this sugya is, remember, we're focusing only on the first case of the Mishnah, namely that a Kohen who is an Arel cannot eat Truma. Where do I know that from? So also we have two possibilities. Rabbi Akiva just has a drasha. Ish, and ish comes to include that an Arel can't eat Truma. The other, so the Tanakama holds that it is, the Rabbanan hold that it is a Gzera Shava of Toshav Sacher from Pesach. Just like by Karban Pesach, an Arel can't, he says Toshav and Sacher by Pesach, and an Arel can't eat Pesach. So too again, Toshav Sacher by Truma tells you that an Arel can't eat Truma. The Gemara then goes a little bit wild in figuring out the application of this drasha and figuring out how expansive you can make it. But here's what we do know, that as much as we're creating a Gzera Shava between Pesach and Truma, the Gzera Shava is limited because there are going to be cases where you can't eat by Pesach, but we would allow you to eat by Truma. What's an example of that kind of case? Aninos. An Onin can't eat Karban Pesach, but an Onin can eat Truma. We'll continue with the drasha and the halacha tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chabran Zoom, Moshe Ben Sion, great to see you, Richard, great to see you.